I used to work as a guard at Fort Knox. I guess I might still officially be one. I'm not really sure what the job title situation is these days. My job was pretty simple. Walk around, monitor stuff, oversee gold movements, general guard duties. It was a pretty sweet government job. I didn't have to actually do much since, how often is Fort Knox actually robbed? I mean, they barely even let the government in here, When was the last time they even let the senators in to check the gold stores, am I right? Anyway, as long as I didn't steal any gold, admin pretty much just left me alone. Sometimes we'd have to pitch in helping move the gold, but it wasn't that bad. I'd probably still be mulling about doing nothing if I wasn't so dang curious. See, the one thing I never quite understood was that every month or so they'd fill this huge freight elevator with gold, and then it would go down and that would be that. We'd never see or hear of it again. We never saw the gold come back up, and as far as any of us guards knew, no one ever went down there. All we had were pet theories. Some people thought there must be a secret lower vault, but then who was down there unloading it? Another popular one was they were lowering it down and shipping it off in a secret underground tunnel. There was always a little bit of chatter about it whenever it had to be loaded up, but we never got any sort of official answer. We got told when and how much, but never told why. We also were told not to talk about the movements of gold to anyone outside the fort, which makes sense, security and all that. Well, the mystery aspect of it ate away at me. I just could not stop thinking about it. I'm not one really for conspiracies, but come on. Literal tons of gold were being lowered down every month. Anyone would be suspicious. I didn't think anything bad was happening, but not knowing was eating away at me. Sure, we had our theories, but they weren't based on anything, just wild speculation about the elevator of gold. No one had any real idea. Honestly, I don't even think our supervisors knew what was going on. I mean, when do they ever? We were all just following orders. Fair enough, that's what they paid us for, but there was no way I could bear to just never find out. I hatched what, at the time, felt like a genius plan. I decided that I would sneak onto the elevator after we loaded it and just ride it down. I know, incredibly creative. I'm very proud of it. Obviously, this wasn't allowed, and I'd probably be fired for it, but when I got down there, I figured I could just tell them I had forgotten my clipboard, and when I went back to get it, I was lowered with the gold by mistake. Thinking back on it now, that's, I guess, obviously a bad plan, but I was just desperate to find out what was going on down there. I didn't really care about risking my job or even really some jail time. The risk was worth it in my mind. Like I said, I'm not much of a conspiracy guy. I didn't have the slightest idea how to pull a good one off. I thought I was real clever, too. I started making it a habit of leaving stuff around. I'd forget my clipboard, coffee, pens, anything that wasn't attached to me. I kept it up for a few months until coworkers started to notice and I got the reputation of forgetting things. I felt so smooth, like a brilliant criminal pulling off a heist. Eventually the day came. We were told that Friday there'd be a load of gold going down. Friday morning, I went into work buzzed, a little liquid courage for my idiotic plan. After we had loaded everything up, I just kind of hid in the back of the elevator behind some of the gold. I'm sure there was a camera that would have caught me clearly hiding, which would have completely destroyed my accident excuse. Well, after a few minutes, I heard the door of the elevator close, and a moment later I felt the elevator lurch into its slow descent. I was pretty excited as the elevator started moving, but it just kept going. After about 20 minutes, the adrenaline of my plan started to fade, and I started to realize what a completely stupid plan it was. If I'm being honest, I kind of started to panic, and after about another 10 minutes, I started to cry out for help. Turns out, after the excitement of planning and starting my plan faded, I realized that maybe going to jail wouldn't be as fun as I thought. It was a long ride down, though. After about an hour, even my panic had faded and I was just kind of bored. Eventually, I did reach the bottom, though. When the elevator stopped, I started to feel a little bit of that earlier excitement, if only for a minute, as I stared at the doors waiting for them to open. I guess for some reason I assumed that whoever was down here would be eager to get at the elevator. But thinking back, I know none of us up top were ever that excited to unload anything either. When the doors did open, I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit of a letdown. It was just another plain hallway like the one up top we loaded the gold in at. It was lit by the same obnoxious fluorescent lights that I guess save power or whatever. And in front of me stood a few workers with the same boring dollies we used to load the gold onto the elevator, wearing the same boring uniforms we had. Well, the uniforms were almost the same. They didn't have any badges or patches associated with Knox or the government or anything. They looked unfazed, which kind of wounded my ego. I guess I thought they'd be more surprised to see me. One of them let out a sigh and a kind of gruff voice asked me, "Curious or accident?" I had rehearsed in my mind what to say when I got down there hundreds of times, but when it actually came to it, I just stood there with a blank expression on my face, mouth slightly open like an idiot. After a moment, he just chuckled and told me not to worry. It was all the same anyway. He gestured to the dollies and told me I knew what to do. I silently complied, helping them unload the gold from the elevator. I didn't even ask them any questions. They were both so calm and unfazed by my showing up, I didn't have it in me to disturb their quiet work. Once the gold was unloaded, they started pushing it down the hallway without saying a word to me. None of it was going how I expected. For a moment, I thought about staying with the elevator and riding it back up, but it had come that far, and my pride wouldn't let me turn around now without getting any answers, so I followed them. After walking behind them for a minute, the same guard who had spoken to me before looked back at me and said, "I guess it was curious." After a couple minutes of walking, we rounded a corner and the smooth, normal walls of the complex gave way to rough-hewn rock. Both of them stopped and looked back at me as if to gauge my reaction. A few more twists and turns and we came to these massive steel doors, really more of a bank vault than a door, truth be told. One of the guards, the same guard who had spoken before, turned to me and asked if my curiosity had been satisfied. His tone was a bit patronizing. I just shook my head, forgetting how stupid it was to admit I was down here on purpose. He got a serious look on his face and said I was free to keep going with them, but I wasn't gonna see what I thought I was gonna see. And I'd be happier going back to the elevator, going home, and forgetting I had ever pulled such a boneheaded stunt. Again, my boneheaded pride did the thinking for me. I said, "I've come this far, might as well see what all the fuss is about." He gave a nod to the other worker, telling him to go ahead, let me get what I want. The other worker, without hesitation, pulled something that looked kind of like a garage door opener out of one of his pockets, glanced over at me, and clicked down a button. I flinched as I heard a grinding, sliding sort of noise to my left, as a segment of the stone wall started to retract back. It was like one of those secret dwarven doors out of The Hobbit or something that you couldn't tell was there until it opened. They laughed at my surprise, and the guard said he told me I wasn't going to see what I expected. This hallway was also stone, but instead of the rough-hewn stone of the passage we had been in, this was a much older stone. It was more cleanly cut, but the stone itself was less clean, if that makes sense. The air coming out of it wasn't the cool, moist air you'd expect from a cave. It was dry and smelled like some sort of spice or herb that I'd never smelled before. They moved the gold into the tunnel, and after I followed them, the guard with the remote clicked it again and the stone door moved itself back into place. As we walked down the tunnel, it felt like we were walking downhill, but As best as I could tell, the floor was actually fairly level. The further we walked, the stronger that organic smell grew. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we came to one of those metal roll-up doors, like the type you see on like a storage unit or a garage. The guard who had spoken before looked at me and smiled and walked over to a chain on the side to raise the door. A warm light flooded into the tunnel as he raised the door. It was more natural than the fluorescent light of the tunnel, but still not completely natural, if that makes sense. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust to the light, and longer still for them to adjust to what I was seeing. Through the door was a giant cavern. The scale was hard to judge at the time, but it looked several miles wide and about as tall. On the roof of the cavern was some sort of light source hanging just below the ceiling, with thin wisps of light dangling down from it towards the ground. Between us and wherever the tendrils of light went were some old-looking buildings. It looked like there were maybe a dozen of them or so. We walked towards the buildings. I tried to get a glimpse of where the tendrils of light were going, but besides some dark shape, I couldn't tell what they were connected to on the ground. They led me to one of the closer buildings and told me to wait outside for a moment as they went in. When they came back, they had an older gentleman with them, wearing the same nondescript uniform they were wearing. He looked me up and down and, with a frown on his face, said, "You don't look like the sort we normally get down here, but I guess you never can tell." He held the door open and gestured for me to go inside. I obliged his gesture and went in. It was a pretty nondescript office setup, a number of desks all in rows with incandescent light bulbs hanging down from the ceiling. He walked over and sat at one of the desks. It had an old-timey typewriter and some miscellaneous papers all stacked nice and neat on it. He gestured for me to sit in a worn-out chair across from him. He sat silently staring at me for a moment, reached into his desk and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. He took one out and lit it and then offered them to me. I don't normally smoke, but this seemed like one of those situations where I was gonna need a cigarette. Once we were both smoking, he broke his silence. "So, is everything as you expected?" as he raised an eyebrow at me. I tried to make some sort of reply, but I wasn't really making much sense, and he quickly raised his hand and told me it didn't matter. He looked at me and asked me if I had ever heard about El Dorado, the city of gold. I nodded, because of course I had. Everyone had. He started telling me the history of people searching for the city of gold and their dreams of untold riches. Truth be told, I didn't listen too closely. I was in a pretty confused state of mind, what with everything that had happened so far, and I honestly didn't care too much for the history at the time. It must have been pretty obvious I wasn't listening. He could see he was losing me, I guess, and so he wrapped up his history lesson and then led right into the next one. He asked me if I had ever heard anything about the Mayan calendar and the end of the world. I looked at him confused, and I asked him, "That big nothing burger doomsday thing?" He looked at me and smiled and said, "You're welcome." I took a long drag on my cigarette. He just stood up and led me outside. We walked between the buildings towards the center of the cavern, closer to those tendrils of light. When we walked around the last building, I finally got a good look at where that light was going. There were 12 large pyramids in a circular pattern, and coming out of the tip of each of them was a stream of light that wound its way up to the central orb. He gestured at the pyramids and whispered, "Behold, the lost city of gold." It was all very dramatic, but I couldn't help but notice the city of gold was a dull gray color. I made a little quiz, something like, "More like the city of lead." He turned to me. I expected him to be mad, but he just nodded like a school teacher after I had answered a question correct. He went on to explain that I was right. It was all lead. Now, said this was what the gold was for. Apparently, the pyramids were gold. Once. Whatever was generating the light apparently slowly ate away at the gold, leaving lead in its place, like a reverse philosopher's stone. Apparently, when they found it, there was almost no gold left. In the 70s, I forget the exact year, but it was when we went off the gold standard, they started adding gold to the pyramids. I asked him, what's the point of turning gold into lead just to keep some magical light going? He didn't say anything, but he guided me over to this telescope they had set up next to one of the buildings. It was one of those fancy big ones, maybe 2 feet in diameter. He gestured to the little peephole thing you look through, so I bent down and looked through it. It was so bright it hurt my eyes after so long down here, but after I got through the searing pain, I could see that it wasn't just a ball of light. Inside of it was something big, writhing around. I couldn't make out what it was at first. It didn't stay still, and there was so much light. I think I made out a giant eye with a vertical pupil, like a snake's. It sent a shiver down my spine. As I stared at this giant eye, I got this sense that whatever it was angry and didn't like being in there. The old man asked me how big the sphere looked. I guess maybe a couple 100 feet wide. He just laughed and said, if only. He told me this was the snake. It had some fancy name that was the Aztec god supposed to eat the world. He said if they hadn't started adding gold back in the 70s, all of the gold in the pyramids would have been consumed in 2012, and the barrier would have actually failed. Apparently they've been adding gold down here to keep it going, and so far it's worked. I asked him how long the gold in Knox would keep up with it. He just stood there staring up at it as he lit another cigarette. He said when they started in the 70s, they added an elevator of gold once a year. He said he expected them to be adding a load every 2 weeks in about 18 months. A couple years from now, it'll be a load a day, and then 2, and so on and so forth. The rate of consumption was accelerating exponentially. The thing up there was growing, moving faster. It was getting restless. The barrier was containing it, but it seemed to be feeding on the energy somehow, growing. When they started, they thought they were saving us. Presumably that's what the people who built this place thought too, but sooner or later we wouldn't be able to mine gold fast enough to keep up with demand. Sooner or later, the band-aid would rip. The guards from earlier came up to us. One of them had a uniform for me to change into. He told me to get changed and then meet them over by the pyramids to help them unload.